What do we think about that? That and more this week on the couch. Scott Barrett, PFF, having one of the weeks of your life, including another visit to the couch. But first things first, breaking news, Duke Johnson, Texan react.
Yeah, so this is really good news for Nick Chubb. Really maximizes his bell cow potential. Remember, targets are worth 2.74 times as much as a carry for a fantasy running back. So just so much more valuable, makes them more consistent on a week-to-week basis. Higher floor, higher ceiling. The problem with Nick Chubb is that Kareem Hunt is waiting in the wings to come back from his suspension and really put a dent in Nick Chubb's upside come your fantasy playoffs. Remember, I'm on record for 2 years in a row saying I think Kareem Hunt's one of the top 5 best running backs in the NFL. So I do think he's going to eat into touches. But for the first half of the season, I don't see why Nick Chubb doesn't have top 6 upside. As far as Houston's backfield goes, Bill O'Brien, the former GM, who was released only a few months ago, both on record multiple times throughout this offseason saying they want a running back by committee situation in 2019. And I think they got it. I don't think Duke Johnson's just going to be the scat back. I could see him getting, maybe upwards of, close to 100 carries, let's say. And of course, the majority of the targets, though Houston really historically hasn't targeted their running backs too heavily. This could put a slight dent into our guy, Kiki Coutee. Yeah. But that's about it for me. He's not a draft day target, Duke Johnson, but he is a name to know for sure. And this does hurt Lamar Miller.
Yeah, I think that, I wasn't necessarily buying into Lamar Miller anyway, unless it's a draft plan where maybe you take one running back in the first 5 picks, and then you just want someone consistent to start the season and see where it goes from there. Lamar Miller's not that exciting, but Duke Johnson might be a better overall running back than Lamar Miller's point. We'll see how the Texans see that. And the joke here is, well, what if the GM that traded for Duke Johnson doesn't agree with the coach? Wait, it's the same guy. They don't have a GM. And it was revealed that Bill O'Brien basically made this deal. And it's funny to see this stuff, Scott, because on one hand, you have people saying, terrible trade. A 3rd-round pick. He just has to play 10 games for it to be a 3rd-round pick. A 3rd-round pick for a back who doesn't even play on every down. But on the other hand, can you deny that this makes them a better team? Makes them a better offense. It helps Deshaun Watson. I agree that, some of those short, get open in space targets that Kiki Coutee got last year might go to Duke Johnson, but that's okay because Cutie's going to run downfield and make a lot of downfield targets. I know you share that love. And look, maybe, I don't know where he's going in drafts now because I always take him in the 7th or 8th round, but he's going 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th round. There's still plenty of room for that to be a profitable pick. And I think the Nick Chubb thing is kind of similar to Kerryon Johnson, where I don't know if people should have needed a nudge to take either one of these guys, but these preseason personnel moves, Theo Riddick getting cut and now Duke Johnson getting traded, will make people more open to taking the plunge. And Nick Chubb's a fascinating proposition because he might be a top 3 running back through the first 8 games, through the first 8 weeks. He's going to be tremendous. He's an underrated receiver also, a la like Leonard Fournette. He wasn't really part of, or even Todd Gurley. Todd Gurley wasn't known as a receiving back when he came out of Georgia. So Chubb's going to, I think, move up, but maybe he should have already been there. They didn't really use Duke Johnson, but that's the easy stuff to react to. The fun stuff to react to is your article, the newest in the Mount Rushmore of fantasy articles. Just ask Torrey Holt, the 96 stats, which is really more like 350. That's what I love about this is you put out there 96 stats. And I think it was our mutual friend Matt Harmon pointing out the inverted 69. So that's always fun too. Did you see, by the way, Bill Belichick cracking a smile when he just something like randomly said 60? You could see it just glance through his brain. Yeah. It
was amazing. The Gronk influence for sure.
Yeah, that's how influential Rob Gronkowski is. There's so much to go through here.
By the way, that was just like the 3rd time Belichick smiled in
ever.
public, and there you go.
It's wonderful. The other one is anytime they ask him about Navy. If you ask him about Navy football, he'll smile. And I could go on.
Lawrence Taylor, special teams. That's it, though.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So this article is fantastic because I think that anybody that is immersed in fantasy football, and if you're watching this or listening to it, surely you are, will have something they believe challenged, not just one thing, a lot of things, or otherwise have things pointed out to you. But Scott, first I want to ask you, what in the process of compiling this epic tome, what surprised you? What was something that made you have to go back and examine your beliefs?
So that's a great question, and I think you're going to like this answer. The last stat I put in there, I was struggling to come up with a third one for the Giants, and I knew it needed to be a Barkley stat. Just thinking about the stat I've referenced in our debates, where I said, he was more productive for fantasy when trailing, when the Giants lost games. And then I was going through old articles, and I remembered another one I had that was like honestly shocking to me. So we know Saquon Barkley is, this very boomer bust runner. But it was really shocking just how true that was. So last season, he totaled 641 yards on 16 carries that went 20 yards or longer. Those numbers in the PFF era, so since 2007, rank third, so the third most yards, and the fifth most such carries. All right, so that sounds like a good thing. Okay, wow, he has these really long runs. That's really valuable for fantasy. That's true. But really, what your main takeaway should just be, no. There's an incoming regression to the mean. So on average, running backs who totaled 400 plus yards and carries that gained 20 or more yards, you saw those numbers drop by 56% in the following season. So even Adrian Peterson, who is known in NFL as
he's the guy people cite.
Exactly.
It's like he had 2,000 yards with Christian Ponder, so who cares, right?
So even though that's true, Peterson's only ever topped Barkley's numbers last year once. And if you look at him by these numbers, every year it's like, okay, 490, 387, 500. So it's all over the map. Basically, you should expect a regression to the mean with Barkley and basically 50%. But not just that, but Barkley was the most boomer bust runner we've ever seen in the PFF era last year. So if you take out all those 20-plus yard carries, Barkley's yards per carry drops from, 5.6 something ridiculous, drops all the way to 2.72, which easily ranks worst of the PFF era of 256 running backs. So you just take all running backs, take out their 20-plus yard runs, and no one saw a greater differential in yards per carry or a worse yards per carry average than Barkley.
I mean, that really fits his scouting report to a T when you watched him at Penn State, too. He'd be willing to give up a 4-yard loss to try to race everybody to the corner and maybe make a 70-yard touchdown. But I think there's a salient point here, which is those running backs that a lot of their value comes from those long runs. That's one of the more arbitrary things, even for a talented running back on the level of Adrian Peterson. The funny thing is that top four is still becoming murkier because of the Ezekiel Elliott holdout situation. Mm-hmm. And then there was a good comment, Mike Triplett, who I've got to meet up with down here at New Orleans sometime, said that, Sean Payton said, we're going to keep Alvin Kamara on a pitch count. He didn't necessarily, that's not saying to rush. I really thought that Kamara was going to get work somewhere between what he was doing with Ingram and without Ingram, which is like between 60 and 80% of the snaps. Sounds like Peyton likes the 60, 61% mix. It doesn't mean that Latavius Murray is going to be as valuable as Mark Ingram was in 2017 or even last year. And really, Ingram wasn't that valuable last year, except when the Saints were blowing teams out. When the Saints were blowing teams out, Ingram was great. But otherwise, Ingram wasn't worth that much. So I'm not that high on Murray, and they may mix a third back in. So that takes the luster off of Kamara. Maybe it's coming back to Christian McCaffrey with this issue with Barkley. But really quickly, just as an aside, because we're about to put out a nice piece on this at Football Guys, and it's one of the biggest questions of fantasy prep right now. It may resolve itself before people's drafts. But Scott, how are you approaching Melvin Gordon, Ezekiel Elliott, and we could even throw like Tony Pollard, Justin Jackson, Austin Eckler? How are you approaching, if you were doing a draft right now, like as soon as we're done recording the show, you're going to go to a draft. How are you approaching Elliott, knowing that in some drafts I'm seeing him fall to the 9th pick, 11th pick, and Gordon, who's falling to the 3rd round?
Yeah, so I'd probably take them at the ADPs you just mentioned, but I draft like you draft, Sig, where I'm willing to take on a bit of risk to gain upside. I want that team that just destroys everyone in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. But so I urge everyone to read Dan Graziano's article today where he talks about this. And basically what he says is that Zeke and Melvin Gordon really have like no leverage and way less leverage than Bell. So the chances of them actually holding out into the season is unlikely. With an asterisk, like Zeke needs to play 8 games to avoid his contract tolling. So maybe he only plays 8 games, and then, that sucks, 8 games of Zeke instead of 16. It's a murky situation, and you need to factor that risk in when valuing these players. But I think we see both guys, stagger back into training camp like a week before week 1, like, hey, miss me? Mm-hmm. Sorry about that. So that's my take on the situation.
Yeah, it probably is better to fade the holdout right now. I think we're all in the industry very overcautious because collectively we were all caught off guard by Le'Veon Bell, not just taking the holdout into the season, but through the entire season. Dan Graziano's piece was fantastic. He's been covering the league forever, and I think he has good insight into these situations. And he predicted that Ezekiel Elliott will sign something before the season starts, and that sounds right to me. All the tone around the Elliott situation has been something's going to get done. The Gordon one might just be based on, in my opinion, whether he's willing to sign a $10 million deal or play for the $5 million or so on his 5th-year option, and then to hope to get more next year. He might be a little easier to fade than Elliott. And I'm not saying that means you move your chips to Eckler or Justin Jackson, but just because Gordon's missed the fantasy playoffs 2 of the last 3 years anyway. So we'll see. And of course, there's also the factor if these guys do hold out of the season, do they right away get put back to their old workload? So it might not just be the games missed. But I think you're right. And one of the things I pointed out in our piece, Scott, was for those week 16 massive pot contests, high stakes, or like the draft best ball tournaments, you want to get in on these because you don't need to just be the best of 12. You need to be the best of thousands of teams. And getting Gordon in the 3rd round who shows up for week 1, or getting Elliott as a late 1st round pick when he has top 4, or really, if there was no cloud hanging over Elliott, I had him at number 1. He's primed for a career year, and this offense looks really exciting. But I think we'll get to see Tony Pollard this weekend. I wanted to run something past you before we get back to your article, because we could get lost in your article, and I don't want to get lost in it yet. Because I really wanted to run something past you, because I like that you echo one of my points is, I think the way I said it, Scott, the way I've always said it is like, I want to make it not fun for the people in my league. I want to put together a team that makes it not fun to play fantasy football in that league. And it strikes me that this year of all years might be the year to do something that in the classic industry expert take, they would say that's crazy. The one thing you should never, ever do. Okay. And I'm sure that you're seeing some of the same things I see. Running backs deep. I mean, look, I can't remember the last time. Usually when you're taking a 3rd or 4th round running back, there's warts. There's big warts. This year, I see multiple guys in the 3rd round who could finish in the top 10, no problem. Wide receiver goes on for miles and miles and miles. I think when I was putting together my wide receiver tier, Scott, there's like 40 or 45 wide receivers that could legitimately be wide receiver 3 or better. And a lot of those wide receiver 3s have in their range of outcomes wide receiver 2 stronger plays. So then you start thinking about week 14, 15, and 16. And that's when it becomes truly a weekly game. And what could be better in a weekly game, Scott, than having Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes? How does it strike you when I say, here's a strategy, draft Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes with your first 2 picks?
All right. So Travis Kelce, I am fully on board with it. If you just look at our projections, PFF's fantasy projections, which year over year tend to be among the best in the industry, we have him outscoring the number 4 tight end, it's Evan Ingram, by 110 fantasy points next year. We have him ranked as wide receiver 4 in total fantasy points. So, just based on that alone, well worth the pick. Then you factor in the Ingram thing, the positional advantage, definitely, well worth a first round pick.
Thank you. Yeah,
for sure. Patrick Mahomes, on the other hand, I wouldn't go that far. I actually have him, I think, late 4th round. And it's just because quarterback is so deep. There's leagues where I'm not even just the last person to draft a quarterback, but I draft my first quarterback when like half the teams already have a backup. I feel so good about, Lamar Jackson and Dak Prescott, Lamar Jackson and Kirk Cousins, let's say, as my quarterback. So I'm not going to take Mahomes, especially that high. Probably not going to take him at all. Deshaun Watson, I love him. Probably 0 shares. Cam Newton's kind of the first guy quarterback I'll start considering. He's going in round 9. I have him like QB4 in my rankings. But yeah, I just wait on quarterback. Tight end, I think, is a different story.
And I see why. And I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, Scott, but I think the key is you should be drafting quarterbacks that have in their top end range of outcomes, top 6 or top 8, not just holding serve. Phillip Rivers, Tom Brady. I think even Kirk Cousins honestly qualifies. Like quarterbacks that can just hold serve for you. That's going to be on the waiver wire this year. A lot of those people, you say people taking their backups. A lot of people are going to be dropping their backup fantasy quarterback because they're going to realize there's just no point. Like using the waiver wire as your backup fantasy quarterback is going to be fine whenever guys like, Derek Carr, Matthew Stafford, Andy Dalton, Sam Darnold, these guys are going to go undrafted in a lot of leagues. I'm fine with that. But like, the punishment of not having a backup quarterback. But you're right. Dak Prescott, top 6, top 8 in his range of outcomes. Lamar Jackson, top 5 in his range of outcomes. I think Mitchell Trubisky has a top 5, top 6 range of outcomes. I like that you mentioned Cam Newton. I think Carson Wentz is another guy with top 3, top 5 range of outcomes.
Oh, yeah.
But I am seeing Mahomes fall to the 4th, and that's really what I wanted to do it in our Apex League. But Sean Siegel took him 2 picks before me, 2 picks right before me, the contrarian. I do believe that Patrick Mahomes, based on last year versus the field, was worth a first-round pick. Now, he would have to maintain that kind of gap to be worth a first-round pick this year. Now that Tyreek Hill is not being suspended, and we're hearing Mecole Hardman is coming along very quickly, and their defense, they did get Morris Claiborne, so that's a good pickup for them. But still, I'm excited. But the main thing that I'm thinking about, Scott, and I'm not saying I'm advocating this, I may dabble with it in a few leagues, is if you get to the playoffs with a lineup that has Mahomes and Kelce. Now, you're right. Hopefully the teams that your other teams making the playoffs are making it because they did take that quarterback who ends up in the top 5, top 8, well outside of the top 10. So that can make it a more even matchup. But in the weekly game, I would not want to have to be facing Mahomes and Kelce. Okay, let's go back to this because another quarterback, speaking of quarterbacks, we haven't mentioned, and my personal favorite stat, just to highlight this, and what I like about a lot of the stats you put together, Scott, is they really you can kind of unpack from them. I know you were a philosophy major, right? Am I imagining that? Symbolic logic, right? Like we can tease or extrapolate out of some of these stats some basic rules of looking for value in fantasy leagues. And we can go back to the good old days 15, 20 years ago when we were still like with stone tablets and like the cavemen at the beginning of 2001 and fantasy analysis. But some of the things were just like, hey, if a running back has high yards per carry on a small number of carries, then maybe he'll get more carries and then he'll be more productive. And your Russell Wilson stat, I think, is really fantastic because it highlights, first of all, just how good Russell Wilson is. And one of the things, and I put this stuff out there because I'm lazy and all y'all are like smart, much smarter than I am and able to use all these tools and create tools, because I really feel like, Scott, we're at the point where we can come up with an idea of how much a target from a quarterback is worth and really start to scale it. So we know like a Patrick Mahomes target is worth more than a target from, Mitchell Trubisky is worth more than a target from Eli Manning. So like one of the really interesting propositions here is like, what's Odell Beckham going to do this year going from Eli Manning targets to Baker Mayfield targets, And I think we could even get to a real fine tooth comb here of like certain quarterbacks targets on different routes or to different parts of the field are worth more. So like Mark Andrews versus Miles Boykin or something like that, because it looks like Lamar Jackson is super comfortable throwing to the middle of the field, not so much outside the hashes. Anyway, you highlight that Russell.
You do a lot of you do a lot of play action passes too,
Mm-hmm.
so that really benefits the tight end in that offense.
Yeah,
like you said, the middle of the field.
Right. And Mark Andrews, I mean, if there's another plan, there's a lot of plans at tight end that are interesting this year. And waiting on Mark Andrews is one of them for sure. And he's also getting that preseason camp buzz that you're looking for the momentum. But this Russell Wilson thing's really interesting to me because, as you said, if Seattle had ranked only average, not a pass-happy offense, just average in dropbacks per game over the last 7 seasons, he would have been the leading fantasy quarterback since entering the league. So is that going to be relevant? Is Russell Wilson another one of those answers at quarterback? And I have some reasons why I think it might be relevant, but I want to hear what you have to say before I say them.
Sure. Remind me to say something about Buffalo after this. But yeah, so I'm kind of avoiding Russell Wilson. Like, that's legitimately his upside. So top 3 in fantasy points per dropback, 6 to 7 seasons. No other quarterback comes close. Just abysmally low dropbacks per game. So the volume doesn't matter for fantasy quarterbacks. It's all efficiency. Like, run the correlations between pass attempts per game and passer rating. Passer rating crushes pass attempts per game. Doesn't really matter. With Wilson, his volume is so bad that it really does matter. If Seattle was just average, not bottom 3 in the league every year, he'd be the number 1 fantasy quarterback. What's going to happen this year? I think they're going to be bottom 3 again in the league this year. I will say he is due for a natural regression in rushing attempts. I think last year was his worst every year in rushing fantasy points, or second worst, or rushing attempts, something like that. So he's going to regress there. And in our projections, even, we have them as bottom the league in pass percentage, bottom the league in dropbacks per game, and he's still, a mid-range to low-end QB1. I just don't see the upside. The head coach, the offensive coordinator, has done nothing but double down on, we want to be a massively slow-paced, run-heavy team that wins on defense. Like, you have a top 3 quarterback in the NFL. I don't know why you're doing that, but yeah, I'm getting my Russell Wilson exposure in DFS. I think games where, it could be a shootout, games where, Seattle's defense is outmatched, where I think Wilson's going to have to throw, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm mostly avoiding in redraft though.
And I'll give a slight counter to that, but we'll stay on Seattle for a second after this. It is the one thing that could get them to middle of like you said, just middle of the pack in dropbacks, is that they traded away their best pass rusher.
Mm-hmm.
The best pass rusher they signed is iffy for week 1, no matter what they say. Ziggy Ansah. I mean, it feels like almost everything that's come out of Seattle camp is positive, and Pete Carroll is a positive guy. But and so they had LJ Collier, their first round draft pick. He's hurt. Bobby Wagner's got another injection in his knee. He'll probably be okay, but we'll see how he feels going into the season. And then their best defensive lineman, a guy I think they were counting on to pick up a lot of the slack in terms of generating pressure, Jerron Reed, is suspended for the first 6 games. Those 6 opponents are Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, Arizona, the Rams, and Cleveland. So those could be your games where whatever the game plan was, Russell Wilson's just going to do his Russell Wilson thing. And Russell Wilson, we know, could be, at the example I like to put, Scott, because you had some good stuff in there about Cliff Kingsbury and plays per game and fantasy potential for Kyler Murray. If Russell Wilson was playing in Arizona, he'd be even probably a better fantasy quarterback than Patrick Mahomes. But another thing I like, again, going back to your philosophy background, you would have been a great lawyer. A lot of fantasy football analysis, or at least presentation of fantasy football analysis, is like lawyering, because you're like walking the jury into the conclusion here. When you go down the things like Russell Wilson had a perfect passer rating targeting Tyler Lockett, and all these other honorifics about Lockett, and then you say, by the way, 3G, and this is great because if you count up the number of bullet points, I mean, you may be into the 500s for all I know, because you got G just on 3 of Seattle that Doug Baldwin retired. So I'm looking at Tyler Lockett, and I'm starting to feel like, especially with AJ Green's injury, like Tyler Lockett probably maps closest to, say, like T.Y. Hilton, who I think is a screaming value in the 3rd round. Well, Lockett you can get in the 4th or 5th round. I mean, is Lockett one of these guys that you start to write in pen in your draft plan just based on the idea of those Russell Wilson targets? And he was a strong wide receiver 2 last year on only 71 targets.
Yeah. So just a random aside. I know you have a pre-law background, or you went to law school.
I have a JD and a bar card in the state of Texas. Now down here in Louisiana, they have a whole different legal system, so I wouldn't be able to practice law here, which is much better.
So I was a philosophy major because I wanted to go to law school. I worked at a law firm. John Proctor, one of the best DFS players in all of football, lawyer, the Siege, CJ Kaltenbach. I always butcher his last name, but lawyer too. So yeah, I mean, what you're doing is, you're comparing, contrasting, weighting different arguments, the for and the against. You're using logic, reason, analysis. Premise to logical conclusion. So there's a big overlap there. So I'm not surprised. A lot of the best writers in fantasy football have that sort of background. So sorry, Tyler Lockett. Yeah, for sure. It's just this is a basic logic kind of thing. It's
right?
The most efficient wide receiver season arguably ever last year. He did that while splitting targets with Doug Baldwin on a team that was one of the slowest paced, most run heavy in many recent seasons. What happened this year? Doug Baldwin, he's gone. Shouldn't that mean, Tyler Lockett should explode? Yes. I mean, if this was any other team, he would be going 2 rounds higher. The problem is, Doug Baldwin, 3-4 seasons, one of PFF's top 10 highest graded wide receivers, crushed in every single efficiency stat. Pete Carroll still refused to give him legitimate wide receiver 1 volume. I think we'll see the same thing with Tyler Lockett this season. But we also know, insane efficiency from whoever that slot wide receiver is in Seattle. And I think I think we should be valuing Tyler Lockett as we value Doug Baldwin pre-most recent injury problems, in which case Tyler Lockett, great value in current drafts.
Yeah, 3rd round pick. And it should only help if DK Metcalf can stay healthy. And it was nice to see he returned from that oblique flare-up really quickly. The defenses are going to have to account for him. And
what's funny about DK Metcalf? One of the stats in here is 71% of his yards of the past 2 seasons came on just 2 routes. And then you factor that in with the combine where, wow, he's, by speed score, one of the top 3 most freakish wide receivers to ever come out. And then he had a 3-cone that was slower than Tom Brady's. Right. Does that say, okay, that makes sense. His 2 best routes were the straight line routes. Maybe doesn't have a lot of he doesn't have great agility. So I own him in a dynasty league. And all these reports out of camp, I follow a ton of Seattle beat writers. All these reports out of camp were great for me. I just kept linking it in the group chat, just trying to sell high. And then at a certain point, just all this buzz from the beat writers, just turned me into a believer. And now I can't sell DK Metcalf for whatever you offer. The buzz is ridiculous on him.
Well, because, and this is where, again, first of all, Russell Wilson might be the best deep ball passer in the league. So if his game is the deep game and Wilson can keep plays alive and Wilson keeps his eyes downfield when he's moving, you saw it work with Tyler Lockett. Now it may work with DK Metcalf. Mm-hmm. But just doing a psychological simulation, Scott, and I think I said this last week on the couch, but I'll just go over it again because I like playing these scenarios out in my head. So let's pretend that you are one of the few cornerbacks that can run in a straight line with DK Metcalf. Now the ball's in the air.
Yeah.
Look at how big this guy is. How are you going to stop, even if you can run with him, how are you going to stop him from catching the ball? And on the hitch, if you have to tackle him, go back, folks, and watch him at Ole Miss. Go ahead.
I think Mike Renner had a great line on this where he was well, first of all, he's not really bad on the other routes. It was kind of just egregious misusage from the coaching staff. But okay, sure. Let's say he is a one-trick pony. That trick wins every single time for him.
Yeah. Yeah. Stephen White, who is one of my favorite draft writers to read, former Tampa Bay Buck, he gets excited. You can tell he's and he said, so what? That's all that it's basically the same sentiment. So what? That's all he can do. That's going to be really important in the NFL. It scares me sometimes, Scott, how we're picking up on the same wavelengths. But I want to then go right next in alphabetical order to Tampa Bay, because I was writing up tight end tiers today, rounding out the tiers series at Football Guys. And I find myself in these tight end premium leagues. I'm doing the Goyd on Roids draft, which is my favorite. We got to get you in Goyd on Roids, Scott. Do you dabble in IDP at all?
No.
Oh, see, because the cool thing, my favorite draft every year is Goyd on Roids, and Chaos Commish, who was the only people out on the Brandon Marshall Island with me in 2006. I think he was the only one that I can remember that said, this guy, Brandon Marshall, might be the best receiver in this draft. Anyway, Goyd on Roids is sweet because you start 2 quarterbacks, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers. I'm sorry, 3 wide receivers, 2 tight ends, so 2 quarterback and 2 tight end. But you also start a defensive tackle, 2 defensive ends, 3 linebackers, 2 cornerbacks, and 2 safeties. And the defensive scoring is so that throughout the entire draft, you're weighing offensive and defensive players. There's no angle. There's no positional angle. You just take players you believe in. And that's what it comes down to. And that's what makes it really fun. The scores every week are like 300 something to 290 something. It feels random, but really you don't try to play these positional games. You just take the players that you believe in. But in these types of leagues, Scott, I find myself gravitating, like in the Scott Fish Bowl, OJ Howard. And I feel like OJ Howard's being overlooked partially because with Evan Ingram, it's the injuries in the suspension for New York. It's like, wow, Evan Ingram, we already thought he was going to be good without Odell Beckham. Look at his numbers without Odell Beckham. Now, if Golden Tate misses the first 4 games, and what are they doing, by the way? I mean, I know it's like the Giants, I feel like we crossed over into some alternate universe, Scott, where our most comical, like pathetic view of the Giants is actually what they are. Like Gettleman delivers lines that we would feel shameful writing for him because it's too on the nose. It's too typecasting him. And then they're doing things like putting Sterling Shepard out there with a broken thumb, and Eli Manning's throwing the ball to him, and he's like shaking his hand after he tries to catch the ball and drops it. I don't understand. So, I mean, I don't know if I want to attach any of my hopes outside of Barkley if he falls to the, say, 3rd pick to the Giants offense this year. But then there's Howard. And I feel like, Scott, what people are overlooking here, but they're not going to overlook it after they read your article, is that OJ Howard was a top 5, top 6 fantasy tight end on a points per game basis last year. And he was getting roughly half the targets of Travis Kelce and Zach Ertz on a per game basis. And how many targets were vacated in the Bucs offense? Like 170 or 200 or something like that. And I know that's a reason to get excited about Chris Godwin. And I find myself wondering, is there a massive blind spot? Some people don't have this blind spot for Mike Evans. Like, are we going to, like a month into the season, Scott, say, well, it really should have been Beckham and Hopkins and Julio and Adams and Evans. Like, it should have been a big 5, not that big 4 at wide receiver, because Evans could also get a bump in targets. He's usually around like in the 130s. It wouldn't be shocking to see him get up to the 160s. But OJ Howard, he's only 24 years old. So, is this the guy that if you don't want to take Kelce because the tight end in the 1st round or early 2nd seems too high, is that the next guy to target for a real difference maker at tight end, not just trying to hold serve, not just trying to get somebody who gives you a low tight end 1 for cheap?
Who's also a 24-year-old tight end to get excited about?
Well, I got Dallas Goedert 24. I don't know.
Hunter Henry.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So here's the thing. Look in this article. People at home, pull it up. It's free. Control F, OJ Howard. Control F, Hunter Henry. And basically what you're going to see is take Hunter Henry's first 2 seasons in the NFL, take OJ Howard's first 2 seasons in the NFL, and it's easily like the most impressive first 2 seasons in the NFL of like almost any tight end ever. And they're basically like essentially evenly matched, where Howard had to compete with Cameron Brate, Henry had to compete with Antonio Gates, only playing like 55% of the team snaps, but their numbers ridiculous, absurd, and like equally absurd. So a huge, really, I'll tweet out in like an hour or so. I'll tweet out comparing them, by a bunch of different stats their first 2 seasons. I'm surprised I haven't done that already, but basically just like, I have no idea what to do. I love both of these guys. I think both of these guys are, super exciting product. I think they're breakouts. I think they're definitely going to break out this year.
And the only thing that I would do to differentiate the two is I just think that I just think Howard can add more value to his targets. I think Howard is more of a vertical tight end. I think Howard's an offense that will allow him to have more opportunities to break big plays. But you're right. But you're right to point out the thing about Gates. Although I do want to point this out. And we're splitting hairs. We're always splitting hairs in fantasy drafts, so we have to take these things into account. But Tom Telesco, the Chargers GM, when he was talking to the media 2 weeks ago, said, "We've had a good amount of private talks with Antonio Gates, but nothing I want to talk about publicly yet. Take that however you want it." So I just know this. If the Chargers can make the Super Bowl this year, it would be sad if Antonio Gates wasn't with them. But either way, Henry's interesting. Howard's interesting. I think people are more focused on Ingram. This is a way you might get that. Because last year, Ertz, nobody could have forecast Ertz. Ertz is going to take some sort of step back. There's just no way Ertz is going to catch as many balls or have as many targets as last year.
Yeah.
And Kittle will probably take a step back, although Kyle Shanahan sounds super milquetoast about his wide receivers right now. So maybe not. And he'll get the Jimmy Garoppolo bump. It's really hard to factor that in. I guess, and some of this, I'm sure we'll hook back into your article, but I just want to take a step back, Scott, and ask you, because we're full on in draft season. I think most of us have at least like 2 slow drafts in our inbox at any time through the whole month of August. Give me a couple. I mean, you mentioned Hunter Henry and Howard. Give me another name or two that is your guy, that just in every draft you're finding yourself taking him.
Just one quick thing on Hunter Henry, because
sure.
You had a Tom Telesco quote. So I have a Tom Telesco quote from the season prior.
Yeah.
In May of last season, he said, "We really feel like this is Henry's time. We need to get him even more involved than we did in the past."
Yeah.
So, that last year was supposed to be the breakout year. Then the injury happened. Remember, he came back for playoffs. So I do think he is going to be fully healthy. Who are my guys this year? Lamar Jackson at quarterback, no question. Probably have more of him than anyone else. Honestly, I'm like really high on this Baltimore offense compared to anyone else. Put a bunch of money down on Lamar Jackson to lead the league in rushing yards, 66 to 1, I think those odds were. I love him. Head coach has a history of using his running backs in a bell cow situation rather than a committee. And I don't think that's being priced into his ADP. And keep in mind, Baltimore's running backs led the league in carries and yards per carry when Lamar Jackson was starting last year. Having a mobile quarterback helps your efficiency. If you go back, 4 or 5 years, Mark Ingram leads all running backs in yards per carry and a bunch of other really cool stats. He's old. I get it. It wasn't great last year, but I just love that situation. And Mark Andrews is another guy. Just all the stats are saying Mark Andrews should be a monster this year. And all the beat writers are saying the exact same thing. Amazing rapport. Looks like the best player in camp. Marquise Brown too is being slept on. Like if he was 100%, like at his ADP right now, I would never leave a best ball draft without him. Think he could be like what Torrey Smith was there maybe, what was it 5 years ago, but on steroids. The injury is a concern. I want beat writers to tell me he's blowing them away. He looks fully healthy. We might not see that, but all 4 are guys who are massive values of ADP.
And I think that to go to your last point, I was just doing Chris Harris's show this morning, and I brought this up because we were talking about training camp storylines. I think that the answer for now is Miles Boykin. And Miles Boykin is getting the reports that you say you want to hear about Marquise Brown. And I love Hollywood Brown. I just don't know if he's going to truly be full speed to open the season. And it's in the Ravens' interest. I mean, they have to have a long view here. They can't push him. And it may well be that I'm saying draft Boykin and let someone else draft Brown because he might get dropped 2 or 3 weeks into the season. And then if he gets up to full speed, then you can pick him up and see how it goes. But I like the idea of putting a chip somewhere on this passing game outside the numbers, play action passing. It only will take a few times a game. And it's what I hoped they were going to do and flip the switch in the playoffs, because I thought they won't do the same thing the second time they face the Chargers. So this article, again, folks, it's Scott Barrett, at Scott Barrett, DFB, Dude Fantasy Bro. And the article's fantastic because I think what's great about this, Scott, and you're another one of the peacemakers. I think Lord Reeves is another one of the peacemakers where we have analytics approaches, and then we have just watching the games, the film tape-based approaches, and the two can be, or my narrative street storytelling approach, and they can be married. And where you've hit gold is when they all agree. And some of the things I think that you put up they seem somewhat elementary, or they seem obvious. But if I just say, Tom Brady's going to rely a lot on Julian Edelman this year, and he should be a third-round pick because he could easily catch 120 balls, that sounds kind of crazy. But then when you unpack the stat of what has Julian Edelman done without Rob Gronkowski, now you have evidence. What are some of the things maybe going into this article that you felt but you didn't have evidence, and then when you went in, the evidence was as strong or even stronger than you suspected for something that intuitively you already grasped?
All right, so you just talked about Julian Edelman. This is something I think I also stole from you. I think I remember a podcast from like 2 years ago where you're saying, Rob Gronkowski might actually be, the best offensive player, non-quarterback since Jerry Rice, or whatever you said. And it just stuck with me. And I've always thought that to be true. Look at his receiving numbers on a per target, per route basis. And they're up there with, like Antonio Brown in a lot of regards, just in terms of efficiency. And then factor in blocking too. And it really might be the case. And so I love Rob Gronkowski, one of the top 5 greatest personalities in NFL history. And he's an amazing player, generational player. So I wanted to do a piece, like a eulogy to Rob Gronkowski as both the fantasy player and the NFL player, and why he's so great. And so one of the things I found was since Gronk entered the league, Brady averages 20.1 fantasy points per game with Gronkowski, 17.5 without. Even more crazy, without Gronkowski, he falls from 103.1 in passer rating to 88.1. That's basically the difference between, the number 5 quarterback last year and Blake Bortles and Case Keenum last year. Like, ridiculously bad. That's even worse than the Eli Manning with and without Odell Beckham Jr. stats, which is worse than anything else you can come up for any other quarterback and receiver. And then Julian Edelman, he averages 18.6 fantasy points per game over the last 16 games Gronk's missed. That would put him at 9th best last year. He's wide receiver 15 by ADP. But basically, do not underrate Gronkowski's loss to this team. The team scores like 3.5 fewer points per game when he's not on the field. This is a generational player, an amazing player. And he's really good.
Okay, so another idea I have as I'm reading through these very compelling stats is that I'm sure that, and I do the same thing. I mean, look, you're going to select 20 players or 18 players or 16 players in a draft, but I might be able to come up with positive things on 80 or 100 players. So some of these players you put together compelling arguments to take the player, but at the same time, I wonder whether you find yourself taking them. Okay. So I'll give you a couple of these guys. Leonard Fournette, because you lay out a great case that when he's on the field, Leonard Fournette is basically running back 1. I mean, even if we unpack some of the great game scripts he got in 2017 when the Jags were peaking, still, especially with all this talk, he's going to get a lot more targets. He can do that. But in the 3rd round or the late 2nd round, where Fournette is available, do you find yourself taking him?
Yeah, I took him in my last draft. I think it was late 3rd, so that's like way more of a value than where he's going. But no, he is a target for me in the 3rd. So one of the stats, I've read a lot of articles where it's like, well, Fournette only averaged blank fantasy points per game, blank touches per game last year. There's a fall off from blah, blah, blah. Right, but you need context. So he he was only on the field for 26 of 32 quarters because of ejection and injury, which like skewed his per game numbers. And then once you adjust for that, he was like just as good in 2017 and if not better. I don't think Fournette is good. Like the most hate I've ever gotten was I had an article the year he came out that said, Dalvin Cook should have went drafted where Fournette was, and Fournette should have went drafted, where Cook was or whatever. And I still believe that. I think Fournette's overrated. All the efficiency numbers last year back that up. It just doesn't matter for fantasy. You want volume. There's less competition for touches this year. I don't see Alfred Blue, I don't see the team justify benching Fournette for Alfred Blue, especially when this is the same regime that drafted him and spent that valuable pick when you could have had, someone who's not a running back and more valuable to the team.
Right, and it's interesting you mentioned Dalvin Cook too, and just to back you up on Fournette, I think when people see preseason, like the real flood, the real fire hose starts tonight. When people watch Raquel Armstead, they're going to see that he just strictly as a between the tackles runner, he's the equal Fournette. He really is. I mean, he's an underrated player. So it's just a question of whether Fournette stays on the coach's good side. But you mentioned Dalvin Cook because that's another one, and you lay out a good case. And I think that if we were to do a list, Scott, of running backs being selected outside of the top 5 who have a legitimate chance, let's say better than 10% chance of finishing in the top 5, Dalvin Cook's on that list. Like nobody should be surprised if Dalvin Cook is a top 5 running back this year. If Dalvin Cook is a first round pick next year and a first half of the first round pick next year, because a lot of things about the system and his usage without a clear backup, kind of like what Devontae Freeman has set up in Atlanta, sets him up for that kind of workload and what should be at least, a reasonably efficient offense. The offensive line should be better this year. They got the Kubiak-Dennison system going. But the second round, I mean, this is, I don't know if it was me and you or someone else, we were talking about this recently, that getting that first round value in the second round. So you have 2 players that are those start them every week, like great bets to be in the top 20 and even excellent bets to be in the top 10 to their position. Dalvin Cook seems like one of those guys, but in the second round where you can also get Nick Chubb or Joe Mixon is falling to the second round now, or, you'll often see Odell Beckham there or Mike Evans or Juju Smith-Schuster. It's a tough round, Scott, to zero in on your guy. Is Dalvin Cook one of your guys in the second round?
Yeah. I mean, like of the guys you mentioned, I think I'd take him over all of them except for Odell Beckham Jr. Like Mixon, lost 2 offensive linemen, maybe also AJ Green. I don't see him getting targets on that team. I think Giovanni Bernard's going to retain that role, in which case, I don't know why he's a first round pick. Dalvin Cook, I think you make a much better case for it. I think I did a good job of outlining in the article. One, he was insanely efficient last year, historically great in terms of efficiency. And that's despite, playing through injuries. Whenever he's healthy, ranks super highly in snap percentage, carry percentage, target percentage, basically a bell cow workload. Latavius Murray's not there, and then Gary Kubiak's there. One of the best stats from this article, I think, was not just how Kubiak goes outside zone heavy and how Cook is an amazing fit for that, but in the last 12 seasons that Gary Kubiak was an offensive coordinator, his offense is ranked top 5 in rushing yards 9 times and top 12 times. And the team went more run heavy towards the latter half of last season. He saw some success with that. I think that they're going to make a point to do that again this year.
Yeah, it's a perfect fit. He just needs to stay on the field. He and Fournette have that same story about it. They just need to stay on the field. Another one of my favorite stats, and I think this one just shows how ridiculous the play calling was at times, or the usage of players was. And it's a discrepancy that should be shocking, but this is why. Here's a running back that I'll take ahead of Leonard Fournette, for instance, Scott. Mm-hmm. And it's about one of these guys. I think that everybody, because Detroit is a underexposed team. Kerryon Johnson's just a badass. He is a badass, and when you look and see that all the other Detroit backs averaged 3.42 yards per carry, and Johnson averaged 5.4 yards per carry. I believe, and you can verify this. I mean, is there any other running back with such a discrepancy between him and the rest of the backs on the roster?
Last year, no. So that led the league in that stat. And it was basically the difference between the worst yards per carry rushing offense in the NFL and the best yards per carry rushing offense. It's like ridiculous. And for whatever reason, all the other Detroit running backs still smashed carry on and rushing attempts per game. It was just egregious usage. And so what I think is really interesting about carry on, and I've been sour on him. I've been like, no, the team says they want a running back by committee situation. I don't draft running backs in running back by committee situations. I want bell cows with big upside, good week to week consistency, things like that. But he just skyrocketed up my rankings with the release of Theo Riddick. You go back and look at everything the team has said regarding how they want to use him. Bob Quinn. We're not a one-back team. It's a running back by committee league, and we're our BBC team. Matt Patricia, after carry-on, had 100 yards on the ground for the first time. A Detroit running back did that in 5 years. Matt Patricia said he played a good amount of snaps. He played 20 of 55 snaps. That's a good amount. And then Patricia Quinn basically doubled down and said the same thing this offseason. But then the running back coach came out and said he doesn't have a number. There's nobody's setting a number for carry on. Whoever the best running back is going to get all the touches. And then a week after that, they released Theo Riddick. And that is huge. There's no other running back on this team who has carry-on's skill at catching passes. So last year, carry-on was a top 10 receiving running back for us in PFF grade. CJ Anderson, just 12% of his career touches have come through the air. And then literally every other person on the roster, Zach Zenner, 7 receptions the past 2 years. Johnson, 11 receptions the past 2 years. Thompson, 16 receptions the past 2 years. None of these guys profile as being a Theo Riddick type. So I think so many of those targets go to carry on. And remember what I said at the start of this podcast, 2.74 targets are worth 2.74 times as much as a carry. That is huge. So he just skyrocketed up my rankings.
Yeah, he's going to be really fun to watch. And you can go back and watch him at Auburn too. And he reminds me of those backs, Scott, who just get stronger as the game goes on. He wants more touches. He relishes the opportunity to outlast the defense, like a Marshawn Lynch, like a Frank Gore, like that they would love 1-on-11, just that would thrill them to get to go. And you saw him. I bring this up a lot at Auburn. One of their plan A's at the goal line was Kerryon Johnson in the Wildcat, and he was successful in that role. So I'm excited to see him. Everyone knows I'm excited about Kiki Coutee, but people need to know that I'm not the only one. And again, in a lawyerly fashion, you lay this out. But sometimes I just think, really as a quick aside, and you can go off on any of these things you want, I look at ADP gaps or ADP comparisons between teammates at wide receiver. It's a really easy 2 data point thing to look at. I don't understand why Curtis Samuel's 3 rounds, 4 rounds behind DJ Moore. Yeah. I don't understand why Marvin Jones is 3-4 rounds behind Kenny Golladay.
Yeah.
And I don't understand. I don't know. I don't ever know what Coutee's ADP actually is, because I take him in the 7th or 8th round. And every round, every draft, I take him far before anybody else would. But I believe he's probably about the same gap from Will Fuller. And you lay out just some, objective, incontrovertible facts about what Coutee's value was, and everybody needs to know that he was nowhere near 100% last year. And as of right now, as of this, I haven't heard anything today yet, so it's another good day so far that Kiki Coutee's not hurt. I didn't just bloom him. So he is healthy, but just lay out for the people and make me feel like I'm not alone in making Coutee one of those players. Like if people said to me, they love this on the radio hit, Scott, where they say, what's the one player you shouldn't leave your draft without? That's the guy. Give us the argument for that.
So one problem with this argument is I do think Will Fuller is really good. He ranked 12th yards per route run last year. He also can't stay healthy. He's also not probably fully healthy right now. Pro Football Doc said, I expect him to have a limited route tree through the first half of the season, and then maybe better towards the latter half of the season. And again, he can't stay healthy. Coutee, my stats for him, so last season, including the postseason, when he played on just half of the team snaps, remember, he had an injury that lingered the entire year, but just, okay, so he played hurt, but also, like, if he played 50% of the snaps, 5 games, he averaged 9.4 targets per game, 17.2 fantasy points per game. Those are wide receiver 1 numbers. I didn't link to it in this article, but if you Google my name, Kiki Coutee, you should find it. He's also like just a ridiculous prospect. So like breakout grades was a stat I invented this year. One of the best breakout grades profiles on there. And like the only other guys who come close is like Juju Smith-Schuster and like 4 other guys who were smash hits. Also like in college, just like crushed at every single stat I find valuable: yards per route run, depth adjusted yards per target, things like that. I just feel super good about his prospects. And I think he's a great wide receiver already. And I think there can be enough volume there to support 3 fantasy relevant wide receivers, though I'm hoping Coutee is the more productive of he and Fuller.
And he was when they were on the field together last year.
Yep.
And he wasn't healthy. Mm-hmm. And also he's in his second year, and you're hearing a lot of buzz about the connection between him and Deshaun Watson.
Everyone's saying he looks like so much better, which is because he looked great last year.
Yeah. So. Well, he looked great last year in a way that you could tell that they had a real stress on making him part of the game plan right away, even though he barely played in training camp. Okay.
I mean, his first game in, he had like 16 targets?
Right. Tied a rookie record, I want to say, for catches in his debut game.
Yeah,
and it was, I think, an overtime game with the Indy, but those are going to be fun games. We've got just like a few minutes left. So I guess I've got to ask, because I have started a firestorm, I think, on Twitter this afternoon, because I think the SB Nation sites are pretty good. I think there's good analysis there. I know the people that write for the SB Nation sites are really in tune with their teams, and a lot of the people that I go to and trust are people who started out writing for those sites and may still write for those sites. But somebody that I trust on on Turf Show Times did a piece on like how do we think the Rams are going to preserve the Gurley. He said, is it going to be easing him in the beginning of the year? Is it going to be maybe in the midseason easing back? Is it going to be at the end of the season easing back? Or is it going to be kind of sporadic on a game-by-game basis? And I quoted him saying that the availability will be a week-to-week decision. And we could see, I wouldn't be surprised, he said, I wouldn't be surprised if it could be like 16 carries one week and then 4 the next week and then 14 the next week. And people are really angry about this. Some people in my mentions are pretty angry about this, partially because of the source, and I guess because it seems like speculation and so on. But I have to ask, because a lot of this is speculation. I mean, look, because the Rams have kept this all under wraps, it is all going to be based on speculation. But your best speculation-based argument, Scott, how are you handling the proposition of whether to take Todd Gurley this year?
Yeah, so I saw that actually a few hours ago. I screenshotted it as like a reminder to read that piece. I think that's really interesting. That's, this can be so frustrating for fantasy owners. But, if he's saying that it's going to be like 16, 4, 16, what happens in that 4 carry game? Could Brown do something? Could my boy Darrell Henderson, who I love?
Yeah, we're in lockstep on that.
Exactly. So, yeah, it just shows you there's value to be had. I'm kind of just avoiding Gurley at this point. There's a point in the draft where he becomes a value. Like Charles Robinson, I think, said 65% of the touches is his guess, whatever, which would make him a value based on ADP. But there's just like so many risks involved. That doesn't include games missed due to injury, games where he's not 100%, games where the Rams are winning by 15 points, so they take him off the field, put someone else in. I just think there's too many risks. So I just don't think I'm ever going to own him this year, and I'm fine with that.
And I think 65% is the plan. And then, like you said, it's subject to how is his knee feeling on any given week. And that's part of the reason that I retweeted that article with that quote, is because I do think, just based on what we've seen from how they handled him after the knee injury last year, they are not going to give us any idea of how they're feeling about Gurley and how Gurley's feeling going into the week. I think that we have enough of a sample size of the Rams to say, and look, if it may go off without incident, Gurley may get 18, 20 touches a week. He may be the first guy whose number's called at the goal line, and he may return mid-low running back one value on a third-round pick, and everyone's going to look really smart if they take him. If his knee doesn't feel off during the season, it's going to be great. But if at some point his knee does feel off, and they're questionable about his availability, I don't think they're going to be straight with us. And that's where the question of best ball leagues versus your lineup setting leagues is going to come in. But that closing hit, and I don't want to go longer than a minute, but the Darrell Henderson thing, you and I are in lockstep on this. And I think that 6th, 7th round is exactly where you should swing from your toes. And if you miss completely and whiff, it's fine. I've won leagues where my first 3 picks were whiffs. You just have to look. And for me, Scott, it's imagination. And I think imagination can help us in fantasy football. And the imagination is put a player of Darrell Henderson's skill and ability in the kind of holes. And it is always, I'm always a caveat with the new players on the offensive line. We have to see that gel. But give him the holes that these light boxes and this offense creates that CJ Anderson had, that Gurley had. What can he do with it? Is imagination part of why you're so hot to trot for Henderson?
Yeah, I will say, check out a recent tweet I had. I think I tweeted you in it, was my conspiracy theory on Darrell Henderson.
There's not enough conspiracy theories in fantasy football, by the way.
I love it. One of the things I said, though, was Sean McVay isn't just Machiavellian with his desire to gain an edge over his opponents. He's Belichickian. What do I mean by that? Do not trust a single word that comes out of his mouth. During the draft, the actual draft in private, Les Snead said Darrell Henderson gives us an Alvin Kamara element. Yet, meanwhile, in the post-draft press conference, Sean McVay, Les Snead, the running backs coach, what did he say? They all said, "Oh, he's like Lance Dunbar. He brings a Lance Dunbar element," which is like
he was a pretty nice player, but yeah.
In college, he was great. Pre-injury, he was pretty good, but still, like not Kamara's level. So, and it was just eerie how they all said exactly the same thing. And like Les Snead was like looking back at Sean McVay the entire time. Like, did I say it right? Is that what you?
Yeah.
And so I just don't trust anything coming out of their mouths. And like Henderson is really freaking good. So, he's one of those like lottery ticket guys who injury happens to Todd Gurley, really could easily swing you your league. And who knows, maybe he doesn't even need an injury.
No, I like Kamara when he was a rookie. And CJ Anderson, if you took the plunge on Anderson in your fantasy championship in week 16 last year, you were rewarded for that. Take good players and good offenses. Darrell Henderson applies. Although he's 5th on the first depth chart, so maybe he needs some motivation. All right, we'll see if he gets his motivation. There's a lot of time for that to change. I'm not backing off of my position.
I will say also, teams always do that. Like Tennessee's depth chart didn't have a single rookie above a starter. And Los Angeles' depth chart only had 1 rookie above a starter. So
look, one thing I know is y'all don't need any motivation. This is a very intense, and it's starting to get more emotional, more intense, and I love it in the fantasy football circles. Now we're going to have preseason games. Now, Scott, we're going to get the annual ritual of the first guy that breaks the 80-yard touchdown, just shooting up the ranks. That's okay, because I love the ebb and flow. I love being part of the rise and fall and maybe stoking it and maybe being too subject and not sober enough about this. But I have to stay sober in the rest of my life. Fantasy football is the release. People like Scott Barrett at Scott Barrett DFB. Again, just check out this is, again, it's a new appointment reading. Now you've done it, Scott. Every year you're going to have to produce something this good. So congratulations. Now you have the expectations of not just Torrey Holt, but the rest of the fantasy football world and even the football world, because this is all stuff that I think it's great because it shows the mindset of Scott, and then of course brings in a lot of hard evidence for things that we might have been feeling in our gut. But whether it's mind-based or gut-based or just pulling it out of the air like I like to do sometimes, it's always so that we can spend this time together and the real time coming up in the football season. We enjoy that together, and we enjoy our time spent on the couch with Scott and many future visits to come. Of course, it's always enjoyable. I didn't get a chance to leave some time open for us to just do some extemporaneous stuff. We were going to talk about cities, because now you're in Houston. We're on that I-10 corridor. Make sure you check out Crawfish and Noodles. I want I want a review when you make it over there, because that place is supposed to be the jam. But there's a lot of great food scene in Houston. Some of the same kind of cultural mashups we have here in New Orleans. Okay, I'm going to stop myself and say we are going to be back. The writing time is coming to a close. I'm still going to be writing, but like the real push, and I'm going to try to get as many people as I can on the couch in the preseason to help y'all. It's an exciting time to be into football, to be into fantasy football, to be part of this community. And I'm happy and excited to be part of this community always, because y'all are so gracious and so very classy. End your broadcast. StreamYard.